I've been thinking about this phrase lately, human, physical, and mental power in strings. It just sort of sticks, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's evocative. It hints at what we can do, our capabilities, but also uh, what pulls on us, what influences those actions.
Exactly. And it turns out there's a whole academic field that digs right into this human agency.
That's right. And that's what this deep dive is all about. We want to unpack that concept for you.
Yeah, our mission basically is to give you a shortcut to understanding what human agency really means.
And why it matters. We've pulled together research from, well, all over sociology, philosophy, psychology, anthropology, even social work.
So we'll hit the theories, how the idea developed over time, cultural differences, the biology and psychology behind it.
Whether other animals have it, the role of emotions, which is fascinating, and yeah, even how AI fits into the picture now.
Okay, let's jump in. From that academic viewpoint, what is human agency like at its core?
Well, fundamentally, it's our capacity to make choices, to act on them, and to actually influence the world.
Influence the world.
Okay. And what's really interesting is how many different lenses you can view this through. Take sociology. Sociologists often see agency as our ability to act autonomously, independently within the social structures we live in, or sometimes even push against them.
So like navigating the rules of society, but also maybe bending or breaking them sometimes.
Exactly. Shaping your own life path.
Yeah.
There's always this debate, though. How much is down to the social structure, the rules, and how much is our individual capacity?
Right.
And they talk about reflexivity, too. That's our ability to consciously think about ourselves, our situation, and then use that thinking to guide our actions.
Okay, so like stopping and thinking, why did I do that? And then changing things.
Precisely. That self-awareness in action. It's not just being swept along.
Got it. So what about philosophy? How do they tackle it? Seems like prime philosophy territory.
Oh, definitely. Philosophers often come at it through something called action theory.
Yes, actions.
Yeah, it basically asks, what makes something an intentional action? What role do our mental states, our beliefs, our desires play in driving what we do?
The why behind it all.
Exactly. And this naturally leads straight into those classic debates about determinism versus free will.
Ah, the big ones. Are we really free, or is it all predetermined?
Right. Are our actions truly our own choice, or just the inevitable result of a chain of prior causes? It really makes you think, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Okay, shifting gears, slightly psychology. How do they frame this power and strings idea?
Psychologists tend to focus on agency as our capability to influence our own functioning, our thoughts, feelings, actions, and the events in our lives.
Okay, influencing ourselves and what happens to us.
Yeah, and Albert Bandura, a really key figure here, he identified 4 core features of agency.
4 features. Okay.
First, there's intentionality. That's forming action plans, having intentions.
Making a plan. Got it.
Second, forethought. So, setting goals for yourself, but also anticipating the likely outcomes of your actions, thinking ahead.
Planning and predicting. Makes sense.
Third is self-reactiveness. This is about regulating ourselves, monitoring our actions, motivating ourselves, adjusting our behavior to stay on track towards our goals.
Like course correcting as you go.
Exactly. And finally, self-reflectiveness. This is our capacity to step back and examine ourselves, our thoughts, our motivations, how effective we are, the meaning of our pursuit.
Ah, okay. Intentionality, forethought, self-reactiveness, self-reflectiveness. It sounds like a pretty active internal process.
It really is. It's like we have this internal guidance and regulation system.
Now, anthropology, that brings culture into it, right?
Right.
How does agency look different across cultures?
Big time. Anthropologists emphasize that agency is always mediated or shaped by our sociocultural context. It's the capacity to act, but always within or sometimes against the specific power structures of your society.
So culture sets the stage, in a way.
It really does. And an interesting, more contemporary idea they discuss is patiency or non-mastery.
Patiency, like being patient.
Not quite like patience. It's more about forms of, well, passivity isn't quite right either. Think of it as situations where agency involves deliberately yielding or being acted upon or acknowledging limits.
Okay. Like maybe trusting an expert or accepting something you can't change.
Exactly. It challenges the idea that agency is always about active control or dominance. Sometimes choosing not to exert direct control is itself an exercise of agency. It's a more nuanced view.
That adds another layer. Okay, and what about social work? They must see agency or the lack of it up close all the time.
Absolutely. From a social work perspective, agency is often defined as the capacity to sort of determine meaning from your environment and derive meaning through purposeful consciousness and reflective action.
Finding meaning through action.
Yes, and they really stress its socially mediated nature. It's this constant back and forth, this reciprocal influence between individuals and their environments. We shape our world, and our world shapes us.
A two-way street. I like that.
Wow.
You mentioned Bandura earlier. Didn't he also talk about different types of agency?
He did, yes. He identified three main forms, which is helpful.
Okay.
There's individual agency. That's the most direct form, you personally exercising control over your actions and environment.
Just me doing my thing.
Pretty much. Then there's proxy agency. This is when you influence someone else, someone who has the resources, knowledge, or power to act on your behalf to get the outcomes you want.
Ah, like hiring a lawyer or asking your boss for something.
Exactly. And the third is collective agency. This is when people work together, pooling their knowledge and resources to achieve common goals they probably couldn't achieve alone.
Like community groups or social movements.
Precisely. Understanding these three, individual, proxy, and collective, helps us see the different ways agency manifests in our lives.
Okay, that theoretical groundwork is really helpful. It gives us a framework. But this idea of agency, it wasn't just invented recently, was it? It must have evolved.
Oh, definitely. Our understanding of agency has shifted quite dramatically over time, often reflecting bigger changes in philosophy and society itself.
So where does the story sort of start?
Well, you could look back to the Enlightenment. That was the key period. You had thinkers like John Locke.
Locke, right. Freedom and rights.
Exactly. He saw freedom as rooted in pursuing our rational self-interest, what psychologists might call instrumental rationality. Then you had Rousseau, who framed freedom more in terms of a moral will, acting according to principles.
A moral compass driving action.
And Kant, who also linked freedom to individual will, but grounded it very firmly in universal moral principles derived through reason.
So a big focus on the rational individual making choices.
Very much so initially. That was the dominant theme. But then the 19th century brought some significant challenges to that view.
How so?
Well, you had thinkers like Marx, who argued that our consciousness and choices are heavily shaped, maybe even determined, by the economic system and the dominant ideologies of the ruling class.
Right, the strings of the economy and power structures.
Exactly. Then Nietzsche came along with this concept of the will to power, this fundamental, perhaps not entirely rational, drive underlying human action.
A deeper, maybe darker force.
And of course, Freud. His work on the unconscious suggested that our conscious, rational mind might not be fully in control. Hidden desires and conflicts could be pulling the strings.
So suddenly, agency looks a lot more complicated. Less purely rational, more influenced by outside forces and inner depths.
Precisely. These thinkers really highlighted the constraints on purely rational individual agency, both external and internal.
So how did social theory kind of absorb all that?
Well, sociologists like Max Weber, for instance, made a key distinction. He emphasized conscious, rational decision-making as what separates human action from mere animal behavior or instinct.
Okay, rationality still matters.
Yes, but later on there was more of a consensus in sociology that society works through this constant interplay. Social structures, norms, institutions, rules provide the context, but it's individual intentional actions that reproduce or sometimes transform those structures.
So it's a dynamic loop. Structure influences action, action influences structure.
You got it. It's this interaction that drives both social stability and social change.
And you mentioned earlier, there seems to be a link between believing in agency and periods of progress.
There often seems to be, yes. Historically, periods marked by strong beliefs in the power of individuals or groups to effect change often coincide with periods of innovation, social reform, scientific breakthroughs.
Like a collective optimism fueling action.
Perhaps. And conversely, when a sense of powerlessness or fatalism becomes widespread, maybe due to war, oppression, or economic hardship, societies can sometimes stagnate. Our belief in our own agency, or lack thereof, seems to matter a lot.
That's powerful. If you feel like you can't make a difference, why try? And you also mentioned AI as a modern challenge.
Right. That's the contemporary edge of this discussion. As AI becomes more capable and integrated into our lives, it raises fundamental questions about human autonomy.
How so?
Well, concerns exist that as AI systems take over more decision-making or tasks previously done by humans, our own sense of control, our sphere of effective action, might shrink. This could potentially erode our lived experience of agency.
Something to definitely keep an eye on. It shows how this isn't just an old philosophical debate, it's constantly evolving.
Exactly. The history shows it's a concept we keep revisiting and redefining as the world changes.
Okay, so we have the theories, the history. Now, culture. You touched on this, but let's dig in. It feels intuitive that how I see my own power in strings would be different depending on where I grew up.
Absolutely crucial point. Culture and society don't just influence agency. They profoundly shape how it's even experienced and expressed.
How does that work? What are the big differences?
Well, a common distinction is between individualistic and collectivistic cultures. In many Western societies, often labeled individualistic.
Like the US or UK?
Often, yes.
Yeah.
There tends to be a very strong emphasis on personal agency, autonomy, independence. The individual is seen as the primary actor, driven by personal goals and achievements. Self-reliance is often highly valued.
Yeah, that sounds familiar. Pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Exactly. Now, contrast that with many collectivistic cultures, perhaps more common in East Asia, parts of Africa, Latin America.
Okay.
There, the emphasis often shifts towards collective agency, interdependence, group harmony, and the well-being of the community or family.
So it's less about me and more about us.
In many ways, yes. Agency might be perceived as flowing from the group, or actions are primarily evaluated based on their benefit to the group, rather than just individual success.
That's a fundamental difference in perspective.
It really is, and it can get even more specific. For instance, some anthropological studies suggest that in traditional Balinese culture, there's a tendency to view life events as guided by complex spiritual forces or a higher power.
Interesting.
This might lead individuals to attribute outcomes less to their own direct efforts and more to fate, destiny, or the will of the gods, which naturally shapes their experience of personal agency.
So your core beliefs about how the world works really matter here.
Absolutely. Religious and philosophical belief systems worldwide have diverse views on free will, determinism, and the nature of agency. While the idea of being able to act seems pretty universal, how it's conceptualized, how much control we're believed to have, can vary hugely.
Okay. And what about things like social class or gender? Those must play a role too.
Definitely. Social structures are key. Things like social class, religious affiliation, gender identity, ethnicity, caste systems, these all create contexts that can either limit or expand the opportunities people have to exercise agency. They create constraints and advantages.
So not everyone starts on a level playing field when it comes to agency.
Not at all. But, and this is important, agency isn't just about accepting those constraints. Individuals, and very significantly groups, can actively challenge those structures. Think about civil rights movements or feminist movements. That's collective agency pushing back against societal limitations.
Right. Using agency to try and change the structures themselves.
Exactly. And this relates to how agency develops in children, too.
How so?
The cultural values transmitted through families, schools, communities profoundly shape how kids develop their sense of self-efficacy, that belief in their own ability to succeed.
Oh, so learning I can do this.
Yes, and their understanding of how they can influence their environment. Different cultures might encourage different levels of emotional expression, different strategies for self-regulation, different ideas about independence versus interdependence, all of which feeds into their developing sense of agency.
Wow. So those early cultural messages run really deep. It's fascinating how much context matters. Okay, let's pivot now to the more internal stuff. Biology and psychology. How are our bodies and minds wired for agency?
Well, they're fundamental to it. You can't really separate agency from our biological and psychological makeup. The mind-body connection is absolutely key.
How does that connection work in relation to agency?
It's a two-way street. Our mental states, stress, confidence, focus, can have direct physical effects. Think about stress leading to headaches or illness. And conversely, our physical state, feeling energetic, feeling pain, impacts our mental capacity and our sense of being able to act. Even just the physical effort involved in doing something can reinforce our sense of agency.
So feeling physically capable boosts your sense of mental agency.
It often does. And practices that bridge mind and body, like mindfulness, which increases self-awareness, or techniques for emotional regulation, can actually enhance our subjective experience of agency, of feeling in control.
Okay, that makes sense. What about genetics? Are some people just born with more agency potential?
That's a tricky question. Genetics certainly lays a foundation. Genes influence traits relevant to agency, like intelligence, temperament, certain personality factors like conscientiousness or novelty seeking.
So there's a genetic component.
Yes, but genes don't determine destiny here. They operate in constant interaction with the environment. It's what we call gene-environment interaction.
Nature and nurture.
Always. Your genetic predispositions might make certain paths easier or harder, but your experiences, your upbringing, your culture, the opportunities you get, they all massively shape how those genetic potentials actually play out. And honestly, identifying specific genes with large effects on complex traits like agency or intelligence is still incredibly difficult. It's usually many genes with small effects working together.
Right, it's not like there's one agency gene.
Yeah.
Okay, and how does this sense of agency actually develop as we grow up, from babyhood onwards?
It's a really gradual, fascinating process. You see precursors even in infancy, early attempts at self-soothing, responding to caregivers, hints of regulating their own state.
Even that early, wow.
Yeah. Then, in the second year of life, you start seeing more clearly goal-directed behavior. Toddlers start showing real intentionality, wanting something and trying different ways to get it.
But the determined toddler phase.
Exactly. Then, around ages 3 to 4, psychologists often mark the emergence of more true self-regulation. Kids start using strategies, like distracting themselves to wait for a treat, showing more flexible control over their impulses and behavior.
Learning to manage themselves.
Right. And this continues developing. Through later childhood and adolescence, self-regulation becomes more strategic, more planful. They get better at setting longer-term goals, anticipating consequences, managing competing demands.
So it gets more sophisticated over time.
Definitely. You can link this to developmental theories like Erik Erikson's stages. He talked about developing autonomy in toddlerhood, that sense of I can do things myself, and then initiative in the preschool years, starting to make plans and carry them out.
Those sound like building blocks for agency.
They really are. And later, particularly in adolescence, the concept of planful competence emerges. This involves things like dependability, self-confidence, intellectual investment, basically being proactive and competent in navigating life. And research shows this planful competence in adolescence is a pretty good predictor of success and well-being in adulthood.
So those skills really matter long-term.
They do. But it's crucial to remember the lifespan perspective. Agency isn't something you just get in childhood and then have. It continues to develop and change throughout life, through that ongoing reciprocal interaction with our environment.
A lifelong process. Oh, hey, this is maybe a bit of a curveball, but does this concept of agency apply only to humans? What about other animals?
That is a fantastic question, and it really pushes us to broaden our thinking. If we step back and consider what's sometimes called biological agency.
Biological agency.
Yeah, the basic capacity of any living system, from a single cell to a complex organism, to actively participate in its own persistence, its own functioning, its own maintenance.
So not just passively reacting, but actively doing things to stay alive and function.
Precisely. From that perspective, agency is fundamental to life itself. It's about actively engaging with the environment to maintain stability and achieve goals, even if those goals are just survival and reproduction.
Okay, so life itself involves some level of agency. But what about the more complex stuff we associate with human agency, like consciousness, planning?
That's where the debate heats up. Traditionally, Western thought often placed humans on a pedestal, assuming we were unique in possessing self-conscious, intentional agency.
The idea of human exceptionalism.
Exactly. But the more we study animal behavior, the more that view gets challenged. We see incredibly complex behaviors suggesting significant agency in many species.
Like what? Give me some examples.
Well, think about the sophisticated communication and collaborative problem-solving in bee colonies, or tool use in manufacturing crows and some primates. Think about evidence suggesting self-awareness in dolphins and elephants, complex social learning, apparent empathy.
Yeah, when you put it like that.
It makes you wonder, right? Some researchers now argue that the difference between human and non-human animal agency might be more a matter of degree and complexity rather than a fundamental absolute divide.
So maybe it's a spectrum of agency across the animal kingdom.
That's one way to think about it. Now, humans clearly have unique capacities, especially related to complex symbolic language and abstract thought, which allows us to create things like laws, institutions, and shared fictional realities on a scale animals don't approach. Our self-awareness seems particularly developed.
Right, we build incredibly complex social worlds.
We do. But that historical bias, the anthropocentric view, you see it in Aristotle talking about the rational soul unique to humans, or Descartes separating mind, human, from mechanical body, animals, that's being questioned by modern science.
So science is moving away from seeing humans as totally separate.
Increasingly, yes. The contemporary scientific view often suggests that biological agency, that active participation in life, doesn't necessarily require conscious intention or self-awareness in the human sense.
Interesting. What are the implications of rethinking animal agency?
Huge implications, really. It touches on our understanding of consciousness itself, our ethical obligations towards animals if they have agency. Does that change how we should treat them? And ultimately, our entire relationship with the natural world. It forces us to reconsider our place within it.
Definitely food for thought. Okay, let's bring it back more squarely to the human experience. Emotions. You said they're crucial for agency. How? I sometimes feel like emotions get in the way of acting rationally.
That's a common feeling, but it's often a misunderstanding of emotions' role. Emotions are absolutely fundamental to agency. They aren't just noise interfering with logic. They are powerful drivers and shapers of our decisions and actions.
Drivers, how so?
Well, think about it. Motivation often stems from emotion desire, fear, excitement, anger. Emotions provide information about our environment and our internal state. Fear signals danger, prompting avoidance. Empathy can motivate helping behavior. They assign value to potential outcomes, influencing our choices.
So they give us information and energy to act.
Exactly. And far from being purely irrational, many emotions are vital for good reasoning. Things like empathy, guilt, compassion, even caution. They're essential components of moral reasoning, intuition, and effective self-regulation. Without emotions, our decision-making would likely be poorer, not better.
Okay, I'm starting to see that. But are emotions the same everywhere, or does culture shape them too?
Another big debate. There's the universalist perspective, suggesting basic emotions have deep biological roots and are recognized across cultures. Think facial expressions for happiness, sadness, anger. But there's also the social constructivist view, which emphasizes how culture teaches us what to feel in certain situations, how to interpret our feelings, and how to express them appropriately. The rules for emotion.
So, maybe a bit of both. Biology gives us the basics, culture shapes the details.
That's a common synthesis, yes. Both biology and culture interact.
Yeah.
Take the specific emotions you asked about earlier, laughter, crying, anger, happiness. They all have biological underpinnings, but how, when, and why we express them is heavily influenced by learning, personal experience, and cultural norms.
Right. Like crying at a wedding might be acceptable in one culture, but not another.
Exactly. And our ability to understand other people's emotions, our theory of mind, is crucial for navigating social agency. We interpret signals, figure out intentions. Sometimes emotional displays are intentional communication. Other times they're more automatic responses.
It's complex, even humor, right, totally subjective.
Absolutely. What one person finds funny, another finds offensive or just flat.
Yeah.
Highly dependent on individual experience and cultural context.
And you mentioned the moral connection again.
Yes, it's critical. Emotions are deeply tied to moral behavior. A deficit in empathy, for instance, is often linked to cruelty or antisocial behavior. Conversely, feelings like empathy, guilt, or righteous anger often motivate pro-social actions, fairness, and justice-seeking. They're part of our moral compass, guiding our agency in social contexts.
Okay, that connection between agency, emotion, and morality seems really important. Let's talk more about the ethical side. Where do ethics and agency intersect?
They are intrinsically linked. You can't really talk about ethics without talking about agency, particularly around concepts like free will and moral responsibility.
Right, the free will question came up earlier. How does that connect to ethics?
Well, if our actions aren't freely chosen, can we truly be held morally responsible for them? This leads to different philosophical camps. You have compatibilists.
Compatibilists?
They argue that free will can coexist with determinism. Even if our actions are caused, they say, we can still be considered free and responsible if our actions align with our conscious desires and values, without external coercion.
So freedom is acting according to your own desires, even if those desires are ultimately caused.
Sort of, yes. Then you have incompatibilists, who argue the opposite.
Okay.
They say true free will is incompatible with determinism. If everything is predetermined, then we don't have the kind of freedom needed for genuine moral responsibility. This view often includes libertarians who believe we do have true free will and hard determinists who believe we don't and thus aren't truly morally responsible.
Wow, okay. Big philosophical stakes there.
Huge. And our belief in free will, regardless of the metaphysical reality, seems important psychologically. Believing you have free will is often linked to feeling a greater sense of autonomy, meaning in life, and self-direction, all aspects closely tied to experiencing agency.
Believing you're in control matters.
It seems to. And ethical considerations extend beyond just free will. They involve moral agency, the capacity to make moral judgments and act on them, and moral status, whether an entity deserves moral consideration.
Traditionally, that was just humans, right?
Mostly, yes. Moral agency was typically attributed to beings capable of voluntary action, understanding consequences, and making free choices, usually adult humans. But discussions are expanding now to consider the moral status and perhaps even agency of non-human animals, AI systems, even ecosystems.
The boundaries are blurring.
They are. And then there are the ethical dilemmas that arise from how we exercise our agency. You asked earlier about why people are sometimes cruel or fail to help others.
Yeah, if we have agency, why the bad stuff?
Well, agency just means capacity to act. It doesn't guarantee acting morally. Factors like lack of empathy, biases, moral disengagement, where people rationalize harmful behavior, differing belief systems about who deserves help, group pressures, all these can lead agency towards harmful or indifferent outcomes.
So agency is a tool, and it can be used for good or ill.
Exactly. And we see ethical dilemmas constantly in areas where agency is central. In technology, think about autonomous weapons. Should they have the agency to make kill decisions, or must a human always be in control?
A very current and scary question.
Indeed. Or in human services, ensuring informed consent respects a client's agency, maintaining confidentiality, balancing autonomy with safety. There are complex ethical challenges everywhere. Agency is involved, even at the intersection of international development and security policy.
It really permeates everything. Okay, let's talk about AI again, but maybe from a different angle. Not just the challenge, but could AI actually help us understand or even enhance human agency?
That's the other side of the coin, and yes, potentially. AI's strength is processing massive amounts of data and identifying complex patterns. So it could be a powerful tool for analyzing the intricacies of human agency. Imagine AI helping researchers untangle how cultural factors, emotional states, cognitive biases, and social networks all interact to shape our choices and actions in ways that are just too complex for us to map out easily on our own.
So AI could help us see the strings more clearly.
Possibly, yes, helping us understand the underlying mechanisms. But goes beyond just analysis. There's potential for AI-powered tools to actively support or even enhance certain aspects of our agency.
How would that work?
Think about personalized AI coaches or assistants. They could provide tailored prompts for self-reflection, help us set and track goals more effectively, offer strategies for improving self-regulation based on our patterns.
Like a personalized agency booster.
Could be. In education, AI might help create adaptive learning systems that foster critical thinking and problem-solving skills, key components of agency. And for individuals with certain disabilities, AI-driven assistive technologies could offer new ways to communicate, navigate environments, and exert control over their lives, thereby increasing their agency.
So AI as an enabler, potentially.
That's the hope in some quarters. Of course, there are ethical considerations there too: data privacy, algorithmic bias, dependency.
Right. It's never simple. Someone asked if AI could just make life perpetually good for us. What's the agency perspective on that?
Yeah, the dream of effortless utopia. Well, AI can certainly make things more convenient, solve problems, remove drudgery. But from an agency perspective, true well-being, a sense of a meaningful life, often involves more than just ease and pleasure.
What does it involve then?
It often involves challenge, growth, overcoming obstacles through our own efforts. That feeling of accomplishment, of having exerted our own power to navigate the strings and achieve something that's deeply tied to our sense of agency and self-worth. A life without any need to strive or make meaningful choices might feel, well, empty, ultimately.
So we actually need the struggle, in a way, to feel fully agentic.
It seems likely. The process of exercising agency, even when it's difficult, is part of what gives life meaning for many people. AI can be a tool to help us analyze and perhaps augment our agency. But that lived experience of self-determination, of being the author of your own actions, that feeling, that remains profoundly human.
So bringing this all home, that initial phrase, human physical and mental power and strings, it really does capture the essence of what the academic world calls human agency, doesn't it?
It really does. It gets at that complex interplay of our capabilities, our power, and all the internal and external factors that influence us, the strings.
And we've seen it's this incredibly multifaceted thing shaped by theories, history, culture, our biology, our feelings, even how we see animals and technology.
Exactly. It's not one simple concept. It's woven through psychology, sociology, philosophy, and more.
And it feels like it's just fundamental to being human across time, across cultures, for everyone, affecting the big historical sweeps down to the tiny choices we make every single day.
Absolutely paramount. Understanding it and thinking about how to foster it in ourselves, in others, in society seems incredibly important. especially now navigating such a complex, rapidly changing world with things like AI developing so fast.
This has been incredibly illuminating. Seriously, it's unpacked so much about why we act the way we do and all the forces at play.
Glad it was helpful. It's an endlessly fascinating topic.
Definitely. So maybe a final thought for everyone listening, something to chew on. Given how pervasive human agency is, how it touches everything, what are the most important ways you can consciously exercise your own agency, your capacity to act and shape things around you? And looking ahead, how do you see technologies like AI potentially helping or maybe hindering that capacity in your own life?
This is DigitView.